Hello and welcome to JPod. This is a podcast on journalists and journalism. My name is Krishna Prasad and it's great to have you here. Even the most uninformed Indian will be able to understand India's troubles with Pakistan and China. But even a genius will find it hard to make sense of India's current relationship with Nepal. When it came to power in 2014, the BJP-led NDA government was naturally expected to develop deeper linkages with what was once the last Hindu kingdom on earth. India and Nepal shared a long border spread across 5 states. There were centuries of shared kinship and culture. Hundreds of thousands of citizens moved across and worked in both countries. And when Nepal became the second country Mr. Narendra Modi visited after becoming Prime Minister, there was great hope. But after the initial hype, the exact opposite has happened. Over the last 6 years, the relationship between India and Nepal has plummeted to a point of ridicule. A petty economic blockade choked Nepal when it had been hit by 2 successive earthquakes. India has had troubles over what Nepal wants to put into its constitution. More recently, India has had issues with the territories Nepal wants to include in its own maps. The result of all this is that Nepal has developed greater proximity and deeper economic ties with China. Mandarin is now formally taught as a language in Nepalese schools. And muddying the waters further is Indian media, especially television media. Last week, Nepalese cable operators blocked TV channels in a fit of outrage over linking Nepal's Prime Minister with China's ambassador to Nepal. My guest today on JPod is Kanak Mani Dikshit, the well-regarded Nepalese journalist and founder of the magazine Himal South Asian. Mr. Dikshit thinks relations between India and Nepal are at its very worst just now. Indian exceptionalism, he says categorically, has eroded the exemplary relationship between the 2 nation states. And sections of Indian media are making things worse, not just between India and Nepal, but also perhaps with China with their undisguised sexism and misogyny. In this podcast, Mr. Dikshit, who studied law at Delhi University during the emergency and went on to study journalism at Columbia later, discusses Indira Gandhi, Narendra Modi, Hindutva, and the ultra-nationalism that is driving Indian media. The deceleration of Indian democracy that began with Indira Gandhi, he says, has accelerated under Modi. But before we get into that conversation, here is a quick message.
Social media, a place where you get news, views, arguments, fun stuff, vicious rants, all of which can drive you insane. It's all so confusing. Don't you wish there was a way to cut through all the noise? Say hello to the Net Paper, a first of its kind newsletter, a digital newspaper in your inbox, one that gets you the news, the views, and the juice. From Facebook and Twitter, TikTok and Instagram. If you wish to get the Net Paper in your email, do go to the netpaper.substack.com and hit subscribe. The Net Paper. All the juice that's fit to share.
Mr. Kanak Mani Dikshit, good morning and thank you very much for joining me on this podcast. I hope you've been keeping fit and staying safe and cycling through your beautiful country during this torrid time.
Yeah, cycling is good.
Cycling is good. That's fantastic. Mr. Dikshit, these are of course not the most salubrious times to be, speaking and talking in South Asia. Yes. India is in the middle of a border row with China. It's locked in a conflict with almost all its neighbors, including Nepal. Pakistan, as always, remains a simmering issue. And in one of your tweets last week, you have spoken of an aggressive China and an agitated India. As the founder of Himal, how do you view the overall South Asia situation just now? What has led to this situation and what do you see going forward?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I like to think of myself as a South Asian journalist, while of course being a citizen of Nepal. So trying to take a overarching regional or subcontinental outlook on matters of economy or geopolitics or environment. It's not always easy because there's so many, the waters are roiled so badly these days, but nevertheless one tries. China's aggressiveness in its geopolitical stance is clear, from the South China Sea to Hong Kong, to the fact that right down on the ground here in Nepal, you find the Chinese embassy, which has always been a kind of a benign presence, whose main interest was that Nepal not be used as any kind of a springboard vis-a-vis Tibet and dissatisfaction in Tibet. In the last 4 or 5 years, China has begun to, if you would use the word, flex its diplomatic muscles, and essentially seems to have begun to make the same mistakes that India has made in the past and not learned from as far as I know, which means a kind of a interventionism through the medium of Nepali polity and Nepali political parties. So that is as far as what I have to say about China for now.
Yeah.
India, the Indian geopolitics as seen from Kathmandu seems to have for too long focused its ire and its anger and its the focus of its diatribes on Pakistan. Pakistan is a feckless state, unfortunately, where all the issues from theocratic nature of the state, that right from the beginning, almost from the beginning, to the rule of the army, to the support for militancy across the line of control in Kashmir, all kinds of negatives that attach to the Pakistani state is a fact. But I've always felt that Indian policymakers and the such as we see from outside India have so much focused on Pakistan that they have done two things. They have forgotten that the people of Pakistan suffer much more than the rest of us in the rest of South Asia. So, but I don't feel any empathy for the kind of pressures that the public of Pakistan is under, from communal pressures, international interventionism, including the United States, cross-border issues, sectarian violence, and secession-related activities from within Pakistan. All of this puts together such a brew where the distress is faced in everything from bomb blasts to all kinds of other dislocations that is suffered by the people of Pakistan. And Pakistan is not a small country, and therefore when you think of the distress, it is humongous and it is a global distress. But none of that seems to impinge upon the discourse that is out of India. And Indian discourse is important because India media has reached around South Asia and around the world, the way other media does not have from the other countries. But the other factor is, vis-a-vis Pakistan, by this exclusive or near exclusive focus on Pakistan, which is a weak enemy, if you will, India seems to have completely neglected the fact that if there is any real adversary to India, it is China. Yeah. And so this swiveling required in the last month or so since Galwan happened, part of that shock and surprise to the Indian masses is because Indian media in particular, and perhaps Indian policymakers, have been overly focused on taking on a weaker partner and forgetting that the real tiger or dragon is out there and waiting. So this is how I see the Chinese ingress into South Asia.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the dragon in the room, because I was hoping to ask you about that a little later. But Mr. Dixit, we are speaking 2 days after Nepal's cable TV operators stopped broadcasting Indian TV channels. This, of course, followed a series of so-called insulting reports on Indian TV channels linking the Nepalese Prime Minister with the Chinese ambassador in Kathmandu. And you yourself have said that sections of Indian media, quote, are derailing diplomacy with their honey trap story on Nepal, unquote. Is this a justified reaction in the sense of this ban, or is Nepal taking Indian television more seriously than even Indians do?
Well, to begin with, I'm never for bans unless something is so prurient, or where if it is something that can ignite violence in society or between countries.
Yes.
That having been said, let me give you the background to the ban in Nepal, which
Yes.
I do hope will be temporary. Is this that Indian television should not be taken seriously the way, particularly North Indian Hindi television as well as some English channels, the names of which should not be used for the sake of the dignity of this discussion we are having. They take on this holier than thou aura, and they do discussion programs that are essentially shouting matches, which are meant to be entertaining to the Indian public and add to your TRP. And there are certain individuals, and some of them tend to be white mustachioed retired generals, and the harsher they speak, the sharper their words, the more some kind of orgasmic reaction seems to come from the, if not the audience, at least from the TRPs. And so, in all of that, as you said, the Indian public at large may or may not see this as reflecting real news, but it is impacting public opinion in India. There is no doubt about it. So, speaking you and me in English, and also thinking of global issues and comparative studies that we happen to have in our brains, we might think that, oh, this is actually bakwas. But
Yeah.
you will have to study the polls to see whether this kind of reportage is having an impact. Because Mr. Modi, for example, after Balakot, won his elections on the coverage of Balakot, which was a disaster, as I understand it, for Indian military activities. But it was actually turned to become a rallying cry for the ultra nationalists. So
Yes.
one could say, I really do believe that the public opinion is being impacted. So on the Nepal-India front, the issues essentially began. I mean, I don't want to go too far back into the historicity of this current conflict, but let me begin by saying that Nepal and India have the idealized, or you might even almost have to say in the past tense, had the ideal South Asian relationship.
Yes.
Because everywhere else you got barbed wire fences and guard dogs and halogen lamps and borders that you can see from the satellites. Nepal and India have got the most evolved frontier that South Asia should be proud of. An open border, cross-border linkages that are cultural, social, economic, and we should in fact be telling Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, this is the kind of frontier that we must evolve into. Instead, what has happened is right now there's such, at the very least at the state-to-state level, there's not been this bad a relationship and this much out in the open. For I don't know in the modern era if it has ever been this poor. So what happened was there was a map that Nepal published in May. It was in June. A new map showing a piece of territory that India has claimed as its own and Nepal claims as its own. I don't want to go into details of that other than to tell you that the Indian public and the Indian policy makers, who also have not been watching Nepal-India relations because they have been too busy with Pakistan to begin with, and the West, and with China a bit, they have not been looking at Nepal. And so for them it comes as a surprise. And so they think it is a new issue. Whereas if you look at it from the Kathmandu perspective, this issue has been bubbling away. And everybody from Atal Bihari Vajpayee to Sushma Swaraj have accepted that there is a dispute in that area of the northwest of Nepal, and that it has to be discussed between the government. It has gone on for decades, from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s to 2010s, and now into 2020. But and this is the term I often use sadly, Indian exceptionalism. We talk about American exceptionalism. Indian scholars talk about American exceptionalism. Let me talk about Indian exceptionalism. Oh, because we didn't know about it, it didn't happen. You guys out there in Kathmandu are raising an issue for the first time ever. And when the people from Kathmandu keep saying, oh, but it's not for the first time ever, you are sort of shunted aside saying, no, first time ever. You should not do these things. You are naughty people. This is the kind of attitude. But unfortunately, it is not a child's play. Suddenly, two enormously, intensely connected nation states of South Asia have now become distanced. We can, if we have time, we can talk about how can we pack this up. We need to do it as quickly as possible. But now that was the history which was picked up with gusto by Indian television.
Yes.
What I need to tell you is what Indian television wallahs, what Indian political analysts and social scientists and others probably do not realize, and the policymakers, is that the Nepali, except for this ban from 2 days ago, Nepali public is actually consuming what you are producing. Yes. And so when you produce something that is ultra nationalistic for your audience, for your TRPs, for your government's sense of self, it is creating an equal and opposite reaction in Nepal. This does not happen to the same extent in Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. In Nepal, Nepali is proficient in Hindi. To understand Hindi channels are locked on, also because Hindi channels are news channels tend to be so much entertainment, people are watching it. So you are actually creating not a force multiplier but a force subtractor when all these excessively violent language comes up. And then now, without talking about everything that came in between, let's talk about what came up with this news item, this item about suddenly television media, not all of them of course, some television were going on and on about some kind of a relationship between Nepal's Prime Minister and the Chinese ambassador in Nepal. Now, so I personally believe that firstly, it was extremely demeaning, insulting, in every way you look at it, of the Nepali Prime Minister. No doubt about it. Because firstly, it's got to be news. If it's not news, it's salacious. It's not even detail. It is salacious, undetailed that you're presenting just because you happen to dislike Mr. K.P. Oli. You can go roughshod over Mr. Oli. And you can also go roughshod over all Nepali sensitivities that attach to not Mr. K.P. Oli but to the Nepali nation state. This is the point about exceptionalism, that Indian television anchors just don't seem to get it. And I don't know what one can't shake them to their senses, I think. Something related to what people call a reset. A whole new credible group of anchors is required in India, is what I can say. But there's one other point that I must get to. Just because you find there is a lady ambassador, a youngish one, who also has a social media presence, doing some traditional dances, and obviously a different kind of a diplomat from the others that you have got, and youngish at that, there is a very prurient and sexist and misogynist angle to this that has not been discussed enough. Yes. One is the geopolitical angle vis-a-vis Nepal's Prime Minister K.P. Sharma Oli, said to have a relationship only because there is an ambassador in China, from China in Nepal, who is seen in the public more than previous ambassadors, at the very point that India has suddenly discovered the danger of China. And so you bring all of this together to claim something on. And so does the Indian media and do Indian policymakers, almost by extension, I should tell you, the two are not the same, but one seems to be completely feckless vis-a-vis the other, meaning the policymakers must be watching askance as television goes out and makes almost like policy for India. Would, rather than think of this only as something that demeans the Nepali nation state, have the policymakers sat back and thought, oh, does this also hurt our relationship with China? Because we are essentially not only targeting the Prime Minister of Nepal, but the formal plenipotentiary representative of Beijing to Kathmandu.
Exactly.
Both. So has that been put into the mix of analysis, number one? Number two, the misogyny of it all. This is something that should, I believe, have all of us feminists up in arms, saying, how dare you do this? Where, not even a question of looking for proof. How dare you do it, full stop? This is how I would look at this from three angles. Vis-a-vis I'm sorry that my response has been a little longish, because I felt there was a need to provide some perspective as to what led up to this whole hoo-ha. But I would say there are three elements. One is something that denigrates the Nepali Prime Minister, elected Prime Minister who represents the Nepali nation state, and hence it denigrates the Nepali people. It denigrates the Chinese people, and it is highly sexist and misogynist. These are the 3 points I wanted to make to you. And if there's any way you can sort of get this idea into the slipstream of Indian media, that it is very, very welcome.
No, I totally agree with you on that. The Kathmandu Post, one of your leading newspapers in the English language in Nepal, said in an editorial yesterday or day before that, quote, a deep crisis of credibility characterizes Indian television media today. They have long discarded the idea that their only loyalty should be towards truth and not towards any individual party or government, unquote. As someone who has studied in India, Mr. Dikshit, and someone who knows Indian politics and culture, indeed as a long-time watcher of the Indian media landscape, what do you think has brought Indian media to this position?
Well, you did mention my time in India. I studied law in Delhi University, did an LLB, graduated in 1978. My classmates were the recent Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi and Justice Deepak Mishra. We were all grateful to be taught by the greats of Indian jurisprudence, such as Latika Sarkar and Professor Bakshi. And I also, by the same, because of the period I was studying there, I was in India during the emergency, saw its implementation and saw its release.
Yeah.
And going back to those times and seeing a slow deceleration of Indian democracy, but an acceleration of that deceleration in the time of Mr. Modi. There is if it is not to be considered a classist term, there is a lumpenization of politics in India in a way that Mrs. Gandhi and the emergency could never have implemented, because she didn't have that network. Even had she wanted to, the Congress party cadre themselves may not have followed her. But you've got the RSS and the Hindutva brigade in every mohalla in most parts of India, and that is where the fact that the top-down message is so dangerous and divisive and negative that it goes right to the capillaries, and it creates political power. It creates silencing, and to think that India is the second largest country in the world, and so many people are impacted by this distress. If we talk about the Muslims, we talk about 200 million Muslims, and the distress of that category. So I think it goes the way India is going right now is a matter of civilizational distress. Besides the individualized, collective, cumulative distress of so many individuals, and the inability to connect the dots. So everything is seen from the perspective of an ultra rightist, Hindutva laced, and I use the term laced, ideology that is actually running the state right now. So it is creating a silencing. I would compare Trump's United States going through a parallel crisis and Mr. Modi's India. In the US, you can see mainstream media pushing back.
Yeah.
In India, I do not see the mainstream media pushing back. And if you then go to the vernaculars, I believe that the situation is even worse. So a whole new reality is being created, which is becomes then the new reality, the new horrific new normal that I believe will lead to. I cannot look ahead, not being a philosopher nor a sociologist, but what kind of accidents lie ahead are seen in the accidents that we have already seen just pre-COVID, the pandemic, and which are probably set to resume after the pandemic sort of trails away. But I'm wondering what it could be the role of media in trying to at least create some kind of a break to this. And I am thinking, I used to think that it's very important for vernacular media to really move in and do all the fact checking and do all the correct reporting required from the ground level up, especially in Hindi. This was my belief since the day Mr. Modi got elected, that there is a need for such momentum in Hindi online, Hindi television, Hindi print. I'm sure some of that is happening. I see programs, for example, by Ravish Kumar and others, but not nearly enough, because we've got such a large market and they're being fed, and the market is being fed poison, essentially, seems from my perspective in Kathmandu. And I must add, my friends who are listening would forgive me for this, for feeling that I can comment on matters of India, but I would flip that to say on India and Indian society, we're all South Asians, and South Asians, the nature of South Asian democracy should be such that persons from one citizenship can critique the state of the other citizenship. Just the way Indian media, and there are many Indian media analysts, media persons who provide sage and sober analysis of other countries, of the neighborhood, so should somebody with a citizenship of Nepal, let us say, should be able to critique the way the directions being taken by Indian society at this critical stage. This is a sort of a proviso I had to add as I speak with such conviction on the directions I believe Indian society is taking.
No, yeah, I think you're fully entitled to do so. But Mr. Dikshit, Nepal was among the first countries Narendra Modi visited upon coming to power in 2014. I think it was the second country he visited. He was the first Indian PM to come to Nepal in 17 years.
Yes.
And with a Hindu nationalist party in charge, Modi was expected to strike a kind of a natural affinity with what was technically the last Hindu kingdom on earth. Listening to you, it seems like that has really derailed in a sort of way, in a major sort of way. Why do you think things have come to such a pass between two nations with such a shared history and culture? What explains this rupture? And I know, China is easily talked, but I think there's something really that is, irritated Nepalese for quite some time, and it's all bursting out, and vice versa.
I think the surprise in India, in New Delhi and elsewhere, about the reaction in Nepal is because attention has not been paid to Nepal. And so what's happening, what is roiling the waters in Kathmandu, what is making Nepalis overactive, I must not defend all of what's happening in Nepal. I am against ultra-nationalism in Nepal as much as I would be against ultra-nationalism in India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka. I am really believing that the open border between Nepal and India, with some provisos to make up for security concerns, should remain open and should be the exemplar for everybody else. I mean, look at it one way. Nepali today can travel to the far corners of India other than certain restricted areas as if he were in his own country, or she. That is not available to a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi. So think of the freedom that we enjoy in Nepal. We have to appreciate that. Likewise, the other way, somebody from India, any citizen, whether it's from Barabanki or from Calicut, wants to go visit Mount Everest and visit the base camp of Mount Everest, just can't do it. There is no restriction at the border. This is the prize that Nepal and India hold together. And this is the prize that we need to carefully and with full practicality nurture. So if this is how it was, and then how did it go bad? It went bad because Nepal-India relationships, Nepal being the quote-unquote weaker power in terms of strategic clout, has had a kind of a protection till the mid-90s even, because Nepal's leaders fought for Indian independence shoulder to shoulder with the Indian leaders. This is something that is not appreciated enough. That that there was so much involvement of Nepali leaders who had to fight the Rana regime in Nepal in the late 1940s, but realized that until you got rid of the British in India, until the Indians got rid of the British in India, you could not get rid of the Rana autocracy in Nepal. So they went shoulder to shoulder. They went to jail together. BP Koirala is the leader of them all. A whole phalanx of Nepali leadership were therefore known to the Indian national leadership. And as the Indian and Nepalis were youngsters when the Indian leaders were already into middle age. So as the Nepali leadership came into power in Nepal, especially after democracy in 1990, you suddenly realize that they were senior to the national Indian leaders in Delhi. So you had a situation where our Prime Minister Krishna Prasad Bhattarai visits Delhi, and from what I have heard, Indian national level ministers would touch his feet. So what did this allow Nepal? It allowed Nepal a kind of a protective umbrella vis-a-vis New Delhi's Nazar, if you will. But what happened is, with the Nepali elders also started moving on, passing on. And when Girija Prasad Koirala passed away, that was the end of that lot, who had this direct interaction with Indian leadership where they could pick up a phone and call the Prime Minister or call any of the ministers. From that point, Nepal fell to a cauldron which was managed by Indian intelligence, RAW and IB. And the embassy in Nepal became so overactive in Nepali affairs, what is termed micromanagement, to the extent that somebody I know in Indian media actually wrote an article in the Hindustan Times openly in an opinion column saying India should use all its overt and covert tools available on Nepal. This is how Nepal fell. And then came Mr. Modi's visit in 2014, which is the point you referred to. So when Mr. Modi came in, he wowed Nepal. Firstly, there is always that Hindutva quotient that he brings with him. And Nepal is also, Nepali mass public, there will be those that will love the idea of a Hindutva uh, uh, taste that is brought into the discourse here in Nepal. Besides, Mr. Modi essentially projected his obeisance to Lord Pashupatinath. He came out of the Garbhagriha with his chandan and his rudraksha and his geru bastra, and then he went to Parliament and he gave one of his classic speeches, and he was given massive applause. And there was even a planned affair where he gets off the car and greets the Nepali public, which was pre-planned, but it seemed spontaneous enough at the time. That is how he sought to patch up the relationship with Nepal, because earlier on, during the conflict years between 1996 and 2006, Nepal was in conflict, and India was pulled in to the conflict with some believable information that India had actually helped support the Maoist insurrection. All of this had created bad blood, but so all of that was sort of about to be wiped away in 2015, with Mr. Modi speaking very, very amenably and pleasantly in the Nepali Constituent Assembly, which also served as parliament. But then what happened was Nepal went ahead and through an elected Constituent Assembly, it adopted its new constitution September 2015, and bang, the axe fell. Nepal's Madhesi population, citizens of Nepal, were essentially made to take responsibility for a blockade that was created and implemented by the Indian government under Mr. Modi. And that was only a kind of a cover that sometimes is repeated even today. But imagine a society that is still reeling from the earthquake of April 2015, April-May 2015, because there were two strong earthquakes, April 26 and May 12, 2015. And you finally, and that actually also helped trigger the energy towards actually adopting and promulgating the new constitution. But so Nepal was still coming out of an incredibly distressful earthquake and its aftermath, and suddenly you have a blockade of all essentials, not only essentials, a complete blockade of the border at all points, at a point where Nepal is still India locked. It is not landlocked, it is India locked. And so 5 months was enough to create enormous ill will within Nepal towards India, which was completely unnecessary, because a constitution was adopted by an elected Constituent Assembly. Again, Indian exceptionalism in media is such that this has never been really presented. The strengths of the Nepali constitution, with some weaknesses for sure, because it is a constitution written by political scientists, and a constitution that also sort of reflected the populism of the day. Nevertheless, a constitution that has such incredible is probably an exaggeration, such fine provisions in relation to what a modern constitution should have in terms of inclusion, in terms of voting practice, the kind of thing that India should actually be studying for its own future evolution of its polity, probably is there in the Nepali constitution. And the Nepali constitution would be required to be amended as the times progress. But there is nothing so negative within it that it needs to be wiped away. Instead, the Indian government, directly as a result of the promulgation of the constitution, it creates a blockade. And this is not the first blockade that Nepal has suffered, mind you, but this is the most excruciating. And so that memory lingers. And Mr. Oli happened to be the leader of essentially led the reaction among the political leaders, the reaction against the Indian action. So, as by virtue, as a reward, he was rewarded with overwhelming votes for the party that he represents, the CPN. And by the way, the Indian media world should also keep in mind something that has almost become a truism. This acceleration of Nepal towards China, this leaning towards China, was triggered by the Indian blockade. Otherwise, it would have something that would have taken its time and evolved, and it's a way one had to go anyway, because Nepal cannot forever remain India locked. You might get blockaded another time, even as we speak. Somebody might be contemplating another blockade. So you do, as a sovereign nation, have to have another opening. And people also tend to forget that Nepal had a very strong connection, Kathmandu Valley, with the Tibetan economy historically, through historical time, from the Lichavi times to the Malla times, till the Young Husband mission into Tibet, which was probably about 1904. So one also needs to have a sense of historicity before one gets all nervous about Nepal tilting towards China, whereas this is also a kind of a revival of historical linkages. Nepal had cultural linkages with the south, but it seems to have had stronger economic linkages with the north, even some level of extraterritoriality and minting of coins for the Tibetan economy. So this was not always the case, but this is how it was. So this is the scenario in which the blockade happened, and the blockade brought the relationship. 2014, Mr. Modi comes and wows Nepal. 2015, he does the blockade, and Nepal is completely clairvoyant on what India is trying to do. Then, after the elections happened, the first elections after the promulgation of the constitution, step by step, the relationship was again on the mend, because there is nothing to do vis-a-vis Nepal, India, but to mend your relationship. And I will share with you why I believe so. The Indian discourse, again, as we see it in Kathmandu, is that, oh, you people are so dependent on us. You are so dependent on us. Your Gurkhas work all over Nepal, all over India. You are a weak economy, etc., etc., etc. The reality is that Nepal sends more remittances to India from Indian citizens working in Nepal than vice versa. Nepal is the 7th largest remittance sending country to India. But much more important than that is the fact that Nepal is helping sustain some of the weakest parts of India which have been neglected by New Delhi. What do I mean by that? I mean Purvanchal, that is eastern UP, Bihar, the current Bihar, that is north of the Ganga. You're talking about even Odisha. The number of poorest of the poor that arrive in Nepal from Odisha, Bihar and Purvanchal are sending back income to the very poorest communities of these areas of India. So it is not true that Nepal is an abject recipient of Indian largesse. There is a genuine, if you look at it, a genuine give and take, which is as it should be. But the narrative is such that Nepal is always asking, and India is always giving, and there is no love for India despite all the love we shower upon Nepal. So this is the situation where we are till, if you want to get into it, till the most recent crisis. That Nepal had a turbulent relationship, then it went up with Mr. Modi's visit, it went down with the blockade, and it was really moving upward. It was actually moving upward with Mr. Modi in Delhi and Mr. Oli in Kathmandu. From what I know, they were all also actually in telephonic touch.
Yes.
So what happened thereafter? What is this Limpiadhura Lipu Lake affair? How did it erupt? Why are suddenly Nepal and India at such loggerheads is something that we do need to discuss.
Yes. But very quickly, in one line, if I were to ask you, has the relationship between India and Nepal kind of reached a point of no return, you think?
Never, because it can never reach the point of no return. Because point of no return means there is war, and there is no possibility of war, other than given even the fact that Nepali citizens fight for the Indian army, and the fact that there is an open border, there is such deep linkages across border communities, and Nepal is in such a is linked so closely to the Indian economy, etc. So, depending on what people mean by point of no return, what I would say that it has never been this bad. You could also say that it cannot get worse because there is nowhere else to go worse than this.
Yes.
Some people talk of a reset. I think I've said once before that we need to go to where we were. But perhaps a reset is also not a bad term if it implies that both countries sit down with cool head and say, now how shall we tackle these issues that keep coming up between us? How shall we tackle the fact that the open border may result in security issues for either country? How shall we tackle the border disagreements, the territorial disputes that exist between the two countries, particularly in the Limpiadhura Triangle and in Shushta by the Gandaki River nearer to Kathmandu? And how shall we deal with the 1950 Treaty of Peace and Friendship? Sorry, that term suddenly got lost in my brain for a while. But indeed, friendship. The 1950 Treaty for Peace and Friendship between Nepal and India of 1950. How do we deal with that in modern times? Because some of those the matters dealt with in that treaty have been overtaken by time. All of this require cooler heads and not heads that speak up on Indian national television channels. Yes. Cooler heads to pull back and say, let's sit down and talk, and let it be off camera. And I guarantee you there is enough to talk about to rebuild this relationship to the way, not only that it can be a great relationship to show Nepalese and Indian citizens, and Nepal and India to show the world, but to be an exemplar for the other relationships of South Asia. I really believe this to be true, and this is where the South Asian-ness in me comes through. I am distressed by the Nepal-India issues right now, also because the exemplary South Asian relationship between two nation states and two societies has been eroded enormously in the last few months, and that doesn't do good for Nepal, India. It doesn't do good for South Asia, for the kind of future we need to fashion for ourselves. And when we talk about a reset, I must mention that there is a tool for that reset already existing should people want to pick it up. It is something known as the Eminent Persons Group between India and Nepal. It worked for about 2 years. It was appointed, such an Eminent Persons Group was put together. I believe it's 5 persons from Nepal, 5 persons from India, eminent political scientists, scholars, and diplomats, and they were appointed by the sitting prime ministers in their earlier term, which means the Prime Minister of Nepal, Mr. Oli, and Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi. They themselves appointed this group, and this group worked on essentially picking up issues that have come up between the two countries, from the border matter to economy to society, and apparently has come up with suggestions for what you might call the reset. Now, what has happened to this study? What has happened to this study is it's essentially gathering dust. The agreement between the signatories And I believe it was a consensus document between the citizens of two countries. It is not binding on the two countries, which is why it's good. Because if it were binding, then there would be too many, there may be some harshness that will come out of all of this. But because it is not binding, it sort of shifts the ball further towards the goal without being very, very casting any, aspersions on either society. So this EPG group report, it was meant to be presented according to the agreement among the members, Indians and Nepalis, to be first presented to Mr. Modi at the PMO in Delhi, and then come to Kathmandu, make a similar presentation to Mr. Oli, and then to be released to the public. It would have been possibly brought about a complete re-evaluation of citizens' relationships and state-to-state relationships. However, for the last almost 2 years, Mr. Modi and his office have not seen fit to find the time to simply receive the report. Grahan is the word, to receive that report. So I believe that it may seem like a technical issue, but I think it is a very geopolitically pregnant issue. What is happening to that EPG report, and why is it not being presented? Now, my friend, former ambassador to Nepal, Rakesh Sood, who pools these reports, saying he has said in a discussion I had with him on camera recently that it has no meaning. I respectfully disagreed with him. I think it potentially has great meaning. So if it has no meaning, then it's all the more reason, if it has no gravitas, let's look to see whether it does or does not. Why keep it under wraps? Especially when the members themselves, including those from India, wanted it out. Including one of the members, the senior members from India, was the current governor of Maharashtra, Mr. Koshyari. Even he was a member of that group.
Yes. So, Mr. Dikshit, I know I have plenty of questions to ask you, and you don't have too much time just now. So, let me ask you the last two questions. And both of those are related to journalism, which is our core concern. Nepal is number 112 on the World Press Freedom Index, and that is a full 30 points higher than India as we speak in the year 2020. Your own magazine, Himal, had to be translocated from Kathmandu to Colombo after you were arrested in 2016 by an anti-corruption body. How would you describe the state of media freedom in Nepal today, and how does it compare to India? Very quickly.
First, your audience might want to know, why did an anti-corruption body go after me? And then maybe put questions over this whole program for having brought on somebody like me. Yeah. So there was a gentleman who had extra constitutional ambitions. Absolutely. He was declared a corrupt bureaucrat by a government commission, but the evolution of the Nepali polity, with the Maoists having a great role in it, and this person being a former royalist, and with Indian involvement, all kinds of, in that mishmash, his name came up for the appointment to a constitutional body, which could be almost like the NAB in Pakistan, the National Accountability Bureau, which is used to go after political opponents by the state. Likewise, as happens with CBI in India, but much worse in Pakistan right now. So there was an attempt to create such an institution. We objected. Some of us in civil society. He got appointed regardless, including through excessive phone calls from a certain embassy to the powers that be. And as a result, he went after me. And it became impossible for me, untenable. This was about 3 years ago. Untenable to run the magazine out of Kathmandu, because even though he was defrocked, his name was Lokman Singh Karki, he was defrocked, but the machinery he got generated against me continued to work. So we had no choice but to send the magazine Himal South Asian over to Sri Lanka, and happily there was a group of civil society actors in Colombo who also felt the importance of South Asian journalism. They took it on, and thankfully the magazine functions healthily out of Colombo right now. And it's a true South Asian, if you look at it one way, it's a true South Asian evolution, that when one country cannot manage something, you pass it on to another one. And maybe it'll become something where this may be a formula we have to think about for future. How can a country that's relatively more free come in when some country goes downhill? And I can see some countries of South Asia going downhill as we speak. So as far as press freedom in Nepal in general is concerned, there have been many attempts, including in the COVID era, where the state tries to come down hard on media, and especially on social media at a time when the protocols are not yet established. And there are laws being drafted, if we're not careful, that would promote phone tapping with relative ease, all kinds of other measures being planned against media. I cannot yet say how much of it is a devious attempt by the present government here in Nepal, and how much of it is just poor drafting of these bills in Parliament. But we do need to be very careful and watch things. But for now, what I can tell you is Nepali media is vibrant the way you will not find vibrancy in, let us say, India right now. In India, for example, it is taboo to critique your own government when it comes to international affairs, especially South Asian affairs. And I believe only a few new print magazines and some portals do it. In Nepal, it is more of a free-for-all. So, relatively speaking, Nepal is still holding the flame of media freedom, but we have to be vigilant because there are certain clouds gathering on the side.
Yeah, but we should never ever forget that Nepalese media was one of the first media in the world. In fact, including India, the very first media to openly criticize Modi. In fact, in 2014 itself, the year he came to power, if you remember, one of the TV stations, Nepal TV, if I'm not wrong, had to take off a caricature of Mr. Modi, if you remember, Mr. Dikshit.
I believe that Nepal is capable of doing. It is not given enough credit for speaking up, because much of the Nepali discourse is in the Nepali language.
Yeah.
So as a result, the vibrancy within Nepal, to respect that vibrancy, even though, as I said, it is endangered, to respect that vibrancy, you need to be into the Nepali language discourse, because overall Nepali media that the Nepali public consumes is in the Nepali language. If you do not see that, then you can only see what is being presented when a time of crisis comes up. So I would say that you have to compare Nepali media to pre-1990, when we were a desert. And India was the exemplar. Indian media, Indian polity, Indian parliamentary democracy was the exemplar. The tragedy right now is, while people still don't think of Nepal as an exemplar, India certainly has fallen from that pedestal. And that is sad fact that those from whom we look, where we look for examples now, I've said many times before, now we got to set our own examples, because we can't look at India for now at least.
Yeah. Well, this is the very last question, Mr. Dikshit. When you launched Himal in 1987 and turned it into a kind of a South Asian magazine in 1996, you did not hyphenate South Asia. You made South Asian a single word, and that was very well appreciated. And at this point in 2020, it looks like South Asia is more splintered than ever before, than even what Himal envisioned. What do you make of this in one final sentence? Can this ever be brought back and stitched up and glued together once again? Or
Absolutely.
is this splintering going to go on?
Absolutely. The worst of times is when you plan for the best of times. And this is the worst of times for South Asian cohabitation. a major responsibility for this has to go to the nation statism that has enveloped us. And this nation statism is actually very much anti-people. I'm also for quote-unquote cultural nationalism, where everybody needs an identity, and you have an identity in your village identity, your linguistic identity, your identity by faith, by city, by province, by language. All of that is good, but in the modern era, identity by nation state is also accepted as one of your cultural, let's say, pillars. But South Asia uniquely cannot only go by what was given to us by the Treaty of Westphalia and the nation states as evolved in Europe, because South Asia is a different kettle of fish, or a different curry altogether, if you will. So we have to have that extra identity of being South Asian, because being South Asian, even though it is a Western term injected into our discourse, South Asianness links us to our history. So being South Asian links an Indian to Mohenjo-daro.
Yeah.
Being South Asian links a Nepali to Bodh Gaya. And so I think in that sense, South Asianness is the term to use now. Because why? Because the term India has been hijacked. India has been hijacked. While everybody blames in India, the BJP tends to blame Mr. Nehru for everything else. I would blame him for one thing, which is, with the stroke of his pen, historical India became India, the nation state, which excluded Pakistan, excluded what then becomes Bangladesh, excluded Sri Lanka. Nepal was always independent. So in that sense, it was not affected by that particular nomenclature evolution. However, everything that was said to be Indian civilizationally, suddenly there was no term for it. You could not even say Indian Ocean, although within India, of course, you have no problem, and neither do I. But for many people, to say Indian civilization becomes a problem, right? And so because India is now a nation state, for that reason you needed a term, and hence South Asia. In fact, that term often was used by Western geostrategists in the 50s, 60s, till in the 70s, 80s. South Asians themselves realized that, well, this partition of India-Pakistan has become a finality. So if you want to go a sense beyond it, then you got to revive this sense of ancient civilizational bonds. Coming down to the present, why South Asia as one word? Because South Asia as separated, which is how it is used generally, is a geographical term. And we at Himal South Asian magazine felt it didn't give it that sense of ownership, of being some way to take it away, make it more cultural than geographical. So we decided for our use in the style guide of Himal South Asian magazine, which you can see, which of course you can look up in himalmag.com or Himalistan, HIMALISTAN.com. You can see that we try to use the term South Asian as one word, saying that this is the way we should go. Let the nation states of South Asia remain as they are. There is no attempt to bring down the superstructure of nation state, but let us accept that there is another identity beyond, for most of us, beyond the nation state. So from the local government and linguistic and other kinds of identities, from our village identity, all the way up to provincial, which tends to be the state or provinces of India, Pakistan, for example, up to the nation state, and then into South Asia. We must go in that direction. There is no other way. I don't see how, in particular, the South Asian idea is vital for India and Pakistan, if they would only recognize it. That such a huge country, the citizens will never have a sense of agency when you are under a centralized state ruled from New Delhi. So the New Delhi rule should continue because India is a nation state, but there must be much more devolution of power so that the individual citizens from Assam to Tamil Nadu to Rajasthan feel much more empowered, rather than to feel that if you have not made it to Delhi, you are a failure. To me, that is a killer. of a situation where people don't feel for themselves. So as a result, when you have when you retain a centralized state structure, you need to the way you rule it is through populism. This is some political scientists may have a problem with what I am suggesting, but my observation is that to keep India as a whole together as a centralized nation state, it is not a federal country as far as I can make out, even though it may be defined as such. It is a centralized nation state, more centralized under Mr. Modi, who should have known better because he comes from his previous stint as Chief Minister of Gujarat state. So he should actually have been the person who understands the need to allow the states, because that is the only other unit available for now. Other states have devolved power on the myriad of topics, so that Delhi's power is reduced to that extent and it is shared with the rest. I believe that that is essential. Otherwise, you will just need to have more and more. You need to ratchet up your populism from, as I have written once before, earlier in the 70s when I was studying in Delhi, the populist message to tie the Indian populace together was roti kapda aur makan. That was a powerful pull, and it was a socio-economic pull. It may have been populist, it may not have been delivered, but that is how you brought your people together, that we are a nation state for the poor. But now you see a situation where nationalism, ultranationalism and Hindutva are being used as a tool to tie the nation state together. To me, not only is it dangerous, but that is not the way for the future of a country as diverse as India. And hence, South Asian, us achieving the state of South Asia is not a unified country of South Asia. It is, if you will, ever more grassroots democracy, starting with provincial or state democracy, where the agency rests with the provinces and states for the two largest countries of South Asia, India and Pakistan. This is how I think we should go, and if we go that way, then we will get the kind of South Asia we want, which is where people feel energized for being part of a unit, where they have a role to play in changing social, political matters. Otherwise, we'll move ever closer towards the abyss of ultranationalism. And each of our countries, all of it started by Pakistan, but sadly India following Pakistan and moving towards that abyss of ultranationalism.
Well, I hope your dream comes true, Mr. Kanakmani Dikshit. Cyclist, children's book writer, journalist, thinker and founder of Himal magazine, Himal South Asian. Thank you very much for joining me from Kathmandu, and thank you for your time and for your candor, Mr. Dikshit. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure, and my namaskar to all your followers.
Thank you so much, sir.
अगर हम आपसे ये सवाल पूछें कि भारत के पहले प्रधानमंत्री का नाम क्या था, तो आप यही कहेंगे कि देश के पहले प्रधानमंत्री पंडित जवाहरलाल नेहरू थे। भारत के छोटे से छोटे स्कूल और बड़ी से बड़ी यूनिवर्सिटी के छात्र यही जवाब देंगे, क्योंकि बचपन से ही भारत में स्कूल की किताबों में यही इतिहास पढ़ाया गया है। आपकी कोई गलती नहीं है, लेकिन ये बात पूरी तरह सच नहीं है। सच ये है कि पंडित जवाहरलाल नेहरू से भी पहले भारत की पहली आजाद सरकार के पहले प्रधानमंत्री नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस थे। शायद आपको इस बात पर यकीन नहीं होगा, लेकिन इसमें आपकी कोई गलती नहीं है। आजाद भारत में सरकारों ने कुछ खास किस्म के इतिहासकारों को ही मान्यता दी, और इन इतिहासकारों ने भारत के इतिहास से जुड़ी बहुत सारी महत्वपूर्ण घटनाओं को आपसे छुपा लिया। नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस भारत की पहली आजाद सरकार के प्रधानमंत्री, विदेश मंत्री और रक्षा मंत्री थे, लेकिन ये बात कभी भी आपको बताई नहीं।
The theme music for J-Pod was composed by me, Krishna Prasad. Many thanks to the radio and TV anchor Vasanti Hariprakash for her support to the Net Paper. And you can follow Kanakmani Dikshit on Twitter at Kanakmani Dikshit. KANAKMANIDIXIT. Thank you very much for listening in.